So we now have our lovely Andrew from Weathertech, who's a friend of Coroma. We often have him here, and we did a wonderful day with him last year, which was mould and condensation. And if anyone can talk about mould and condensation and be excited about it, they've got to be a very special person. So we're talking about pathways to complying with the Australian National Construction Code. Please put your hands together for Andrew Savage. Savage by name, but not by nature.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Deborah. Yes, Weathertech and Coroma on Collins go way back, and Deborah's become a very important part of the Weathertech family, along with her team here. So thank you for a lovely introduction. My name's Andrew Savage. I'm Business Development Manager for Architecture and Design for Weathertech in New South Wales. Please come and have a chat with me after the presentation. I'm doing 2 presentations today. I don't know if we can get this up on the screen, can we, Mr. Zach? But today is a formal CPD point, like all of your CPD presentations today, that you're attending today. And this one's the reason why we've gone down this path. As you probably know, Weathertech is a cladding manufacturer. We manufacture Australian hardwood cladding systems up in Heatherbrae, just north of Newcastle. And we've recently achieved Codemark certification. Hands up, any of you specifiers who are familiar with Codemark? Some of you are shaking your heads, a couple have put your hands up. After this morning's presentation, you're going to be an expert on Codemark, I assure you. It is a fairly dry presentation, and it is quite technical, and we go into a lot of detail, so please bear with me. I'll try and make it as interesting as possible, but if you hang around for my second presentation, which is all about addressing condensation and mould in stud wall construction, so that's hardly dry, it's slightly wet and maybe slightly mouldy, but it is a bit more interesting than this one. But this one, there's a lot of important information for you. So the objectives of the CPD are to firstly understand the 6 methods of documentary evidence accepted by certifiers, PCAs, who are enforcing the National Construction Code, and to understand the difference between each method and where they may be used. So it's all about compliance, and as we know, at the moment, there's a lot of controversy, and I saw on the news last night that there's that big tower building in Borkham Hills or Castle Hill, 5 big towers by a particular developer, and the building commissioner has basically said, then you're not getting an occupancy certificate because there's so much cracking going on in the building. So as we know, compliance and conformance are big issues in our industry at the moment. If you want to know where we got the information about today's presentation, we've got the ABCB's Evidence of Suitability Handbook. There's also obviously our Construction Code Volume 1 and Volume 2. And we also had some input from one of the ABCB board members, a gentleman by the name of Andrew Dunn, and he has made sure that everything that we're presenting to you today is hunky-dory. You can download these documents for free, I believe now, from abcb.gov.au. So let's get into it. If anyone has any questions at all, please raise your hands. If I can, I'll try and get you guys involved, maybe with hand raising. If I don't know any of you, so I can't pick on any of you. Actually, I do know one of you. I might pick on her. I can see her at the back there. Anyway, as you guys are probably aware, the National Construction Code is a performance-based code, and it contains performance requirements for the construction of buildings. And the next slide talks a little bit more about this. When we say it's a performance-based code, there's 2 main pathways which we'll talk about shortly. I'm sure you're aware of deemed to satisfy provisions and performance solution pathways. Both of those are performance-based. So don't get confused by it being a performance-based code. And when we're complying with the construction code, there's the governing requirements of the code. Think of those as the rules, if you like. And then the performance requirements, how do the products or the design solutions or whatever perform and comply with those standards or tests or whatever. So the governing requirements of the code are the rules and instructions for basically creating buildings that comply. And the governing requirements include interpretations, definitions of the code, how do we comply with the code in practical terms. There's different applications in different states and territories. And normally I'd ask somebody to tell me, why do you think we might have different rules, say, in Tasmania versus northern Queensland? And the answer is obviously climate, because the climate varies quite a lot across the country. So that's why we have different rules across states and territories. There's applying documents referenced within the code, and they tend to be standards and tests and things like that that we need to meet. And then what we're talking about today is documenting the suitability of the design, construction and or use of materials in order to comply with the code. So the type of information that you might need to provide to a PCA or a certifier to show that your design solutions and product selections conform and comply with the rules. And then, of course, we classify buildings by their characteristics and intended use. So we have our Class 110, which is kind of, single homes, terrace house, townhouse, duplex, those types of fairly standard residential buildings. And then Class 10, the non-habitable associated outbuildings such as garages, sheds, swimming pools, retaining walls and so on. They're in Volume 2, and then Volume 1 is made up of Class 2 to 9, as we know, which are all of our commercial classes. So without going into too much detail about this, you guys are fully aware that the two main pathways to complying with our construction code is either performance solution or deemed to satisfy. Or it can be a combination of both performance solutions and deemed to satisfy solutions. So let's have a look at each of these. And I tend to start sort of, down here at deemed to satisfy, because it's generally the way we design and select products probably for the bulk of compliance. And so a deemed to satisfy provisions will be within the code. And if you tick enough of those boxes, you'll be able to basically design something which conforms and complies. And it tends to be fairly standard stuff, such as brick veneer wall construction, lightweight cladding construction, truss roofs. And I'm talking more here with your Class 110s. I believe that in the NCC in 2022, next year, we will finally have a deemed to satisfy solution for cladding in Volume 1 for our Class 2 to 9 commercial, because at the moment I believe it's always a performance solution. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what I'm told. So basically, deemed to satisfy, you will have an assessment method, and there'll be evidence of suitability, and we're going to talk about that shortly in this presentation, and expert judgment. But basically, we all know and love deemed to satisfy because it's a very easy way to comply. When we're sometimes doing something a little bit out of the ordinary, we will go down the performance solution pathway. And when I ask specifiers, give me an example of a performance solution, they generally talk about access egress. It might be, on a Class 2, you've got more than 6 metres to your closest fire exit, and they work with access consultants to come up with a performance solution to make sure that the intent of the code is met, even if you can't go down the deemed to satisfy pathway. There might be other reasons as well. I've already mentioned cladding on a Class 2 to 9 building is always a performance solution in the current NCC. And again, we'll have evidence of suitability, which we're going to talk about shortly, verification methods, expert judgment, and these things are all interrelate, because our expert judgment is potentially also going to include comparison with some of the deemed to satisfy provisions, or a solution which is proved to be at least equivalent to the deemed to satisfy provisions. One of the things that's recently changed when it comes to compliance is our expert judgments can no longer be an opinion. They have to follow a logical process of research, if you like, to basically sort of not just say, in my opinion, I believe that. You actually have to compare with the deemed to satisfy provisions, for example, and show that what you're proposing will at least be equivalent with those. So if we're looking in Volumes 1 or Volumes 2 of the NCC, if you go to Part A5, you'll find the 6 options that can be used of evidence to support that the use of materials, products, forms of construction or design meet the requirements of the NCC. And we refer to these things as product components. That is material, products, forms of construction and designs. They're referred to as product components. So when it comes to evidence of suitability, this is pretty much the information that you may be providing to a certifier or a PCA around your product selections and your design solutions as evidence to show that they conform and comply with the rules. And there's different hierarchy, which we'll look at shortly. And the most appropriate form of evidence is going to vary depending on the type of project, the application we're talking about, and so on. And certain things will have higher risk associated with them, thereby requiring a higher level of rigour when it comes to providing evidence, and some will have a lower amount of risk associated. All of the forms, the 6 forms of evidence that we're going to be looking at, are acceptable, and we'll give examples of where they can be used. So this is taken from the code, from section A5, and also in the compliance handbook that we mentioned earlier. And you'll see that we have our 6 methods. The most rigorous is Codemark, or Codemark Australia. They provide a certificate of conformity. And there's also Watermark. I find a lot of specifiers are quite familiar with Watermark. I think Watermark has done a particularly good job of promoting their certification system around plumbing, hardware, taps and toots and everything that Caroma has here. I'd imagine virtually all Caroma products would be watermarked. Codemark is a similar kind of independent certification system around compliance of all construction materials. So not only plumbing, but cladding and you name it. I believe that there's only about 85 companies in Australia that have so far taken up Codemark certification, but we'll look at Codemark in quite a bit of detail shortly. And then we'll touch on the other 5 methods of providing evidence of suitability in a lot less detail. So please don't think that we're going to go on about certificates of accreditation and all these other less rigorous methods of providing evidence at the same level that we will with Codemark, because otherwise we'd be here all day. So we've got Codemark, that's the most rigorous. We've got certificates of accreditation, very similar to Codemark, but a state-based system. We have certificates issued by a certification body, reports issued by an accredited testing laboratory, certificate or report from an engineer or other appropriately qualified person, and then other forms of documentary evidence, including things like a product technical statement. Everything from certificate issued by a certification body down, these also can make up our Certificate of Accreditation and our Codemark certificate. All of these things are interrelated and they do overlap to an extent, and hopefully it'll start to make a bit more sense as we move through. So when we're talking about product components, and we mentioned before that these are materials, products, forms of construction and design solutions, if you like. So let's think of a product. Let's think of Weathertech, okay? Or let's think of any type of product, Caroma plumbing hardware. If we use these products and the consequences of failure of that product is assessed as high. So let's not talk about Caroma or Weathertech. Let's talk about, I'll give you an example. I own an apartment in Walleye Creek, very nicely designed and built apartment. Unfortunately, it is riddled with issues around waterproofing membranes. And now the bill for the 90 lot owners to fix these waterproofing membranes is going to be around about $2 million. And it's going to be very, very expensive and very messy to come in and pull out all of these garden beds and dig up all these veranda tiles and basically clean up all the membranes and apply them again and retile and re-establish the garden beds. So the risk of failure of that membrane is high. The costs and inconvenience associated with fixing that, unfortunately, is highly inconvenient, highly expensive. So we need to use an evidence of suitability of conformance higher on our 6 methods. So something like Codemark would be ideal for a apartment membrane or any membrane in any application. So Codemark was introduced alongside Watermark to provide users with a source of independent recognition to show that the product or the design solution or whatever it happens to be, but let's say in this case the product is a membrane, provided that it is installed according to the manufacturer's instructions, which in my case, in the apartment that I own, hasn't happened. So it is important that it is installed correctly. It should work and you shouldn't have any issues with it. So it's kind of been a scheme to try and simplify the whole certification process. So on the other end of the scale, if we have products where the consequences of failure may have a lower risk, so let's talk about hardboard underlay that's been used for 150 years to go over a flooring substrate, be it concrete or tongue and groove flooring, and then we're putting vinyl flooring or carpet or something on top of that. The consequence of failure of that particular product and the rate at which these types of products fail is minimal. So even if it did fail, it's not that hard to carefully take up your carpet or your vinyl, replace the underlay and put it all back again. So, and how often do these products fail? Pretty rarely. They've been made for over 100 years and they tend to be very reliable products. So we could use something like a product technical statement, which is at the lower end of our level of rigour in terms of providing conformity or information to our PCA or certifier around compliance. So let's now go and look at each of these individually and have a better understanding of how they work. Does anyone have any questions at this stage? No? Okay. I did tell you this is dry. Hang around for the next one because it's a lot more entertaining. But anyway, let's look at Codemark. And as I said, we will be going into this in quite a bit of detail, and we won't go to the same level of detail with the other 5 evidences of suitability. So Codemark's a voluntary third-party building product certification scheme. It's been around for about 20-odd years. And originally it was set up so that manufacturers of new or innovative products could show that their products comply with the intent of the construction code, especially in situations where there is no deemed to satisfy pathway for that particular product or design solution or whatever. It's now sort of become a bit more general, and even companies like Weathertech and James Hardie and Boral Bricks and people that have deemed to satisfy pathways within the code still use Codemark because it gives us additional credibility and also helps us in many ways, which we'll talk about shortly. Codemark was set up by ABCB in consultation with Australian state and territory governments, industry groups and certifying bodies. So it is quite a difficult thing to achieve as well, Codemark. There are a lot of rules, and for Weathertech to get Codemark on initially our 2 main product lines, but we're about to introduce another 2 product lines to Codemark. It's taken us about 2.5 years and cost us over $250,000 to go through the process. So but it's worth it because and you'll learn why shortly. It's administered by JASANS, the Joint Accreditation System of Australia and New Zealand, and they also administer other certification and conformity bodies, things like CertMark, which is another certification scheme, SAI Global, the company that brings us all of our standards in Australia, and a number of other organisations involved in certifying across all industries. They're a busy company, JASANS. This is the Weathertech's Codemark Australia Certificate of Conformity. And you'll notice down in the bottom right-hand corner, this is page 1 of 10. So they're quite a comprehensive document. And within this document, we list all of the parts of the NCC that we comply with and the standards and various test results that are required in order to achieve Codemark Certificate of Conformity. And there's 5 main areas that Weathertech is covered in our Codemark certificate, and I'll explain those shortly. You don't have to do 5 or 10 or 15 or 2. You can get a Codemark certificate just on one part of the NCC. So it's very, very important as specifiers that you guys check the class and type of construction that you're proposing, look at the Codemark certificate and make sure that the minimum standards within the NCC are included in that Codemark Certificate of Conformity. That's really, really important because some people who have a bit of an idea of what Codemark means, they go, oh, doesn't that mean you can kind of use it everywhere? Well, no. I can't think of many products that you can use across all types and classes of building. You still need to correlate that the testing that's been done meets the minimum requirements of your project. So keep that in mind. So we've already said it's a voluntary scheme. Suppliers and manufacturers can use Codemark to demonstrate that their product meets certain NCC requirements. And then when we did our Codemark certification journey, if you like, with Weathertech, we were introduced to Codemark Australia certification bodies. And these are consultants, if you like, that will help us to kind of work out who we need to talk to, what tests we need to do and so on. And there's obviously rules, and you only get a certificate of conformity if you meet those rules. And it's all about testing pretty much to a large extent. And a certificate is only given when the product is demonstrated to meet the NCC rules for which you're testing. So keep that in mind. So our two main lines, which have been Codemark certified so far, is Weathertech's self-lock weatherboards and Weathergroove cladding, architectural panels. One of the 5 areas that we have had Codemark certified is weatherproofing performance requirements, which are referenced in both Volume 1 and Volume 2. And it says here, when installed according to the installation manual. Very important. You know, you could try and hold it up with blue tack, but unless it's installed according to the manufacturer's instructions, you will not get a warrantable or certifiable outcome. We've already talked about Codemark being similar to Watermark, which is a plumbing scheme for plumbing hardware. So here we're seeing our couple of examples of our Weathergroove architectural panels, which have been Codemarked, and here's our self-lock weatherboards that have been Codemarked. In a few weeks' time, we'll also have our more traditional overlapping weatherboards, our PrimeLock and Classic ranges, also Codemarked. Codemark's not compulsory. As we said before, it's voluntary, but it does help to boost consumer confidence. So it demonstrates compliance for newer and innovative products that have no standard for manufacture and may not have a deemed to satisfy pathway in the construction code. Here's the big kind of money fact. Automatic legislative acceptance by approving authorities. I'll say that again, automatic legislative acceptance by approving authorities. So what that means is, if you select a product which has Codemark certification and all of the test results and standards that are required as a minimum standard by your project are included in that Codemark certificate, the PCR certifier is legally obliged to approve its use. And if someone comes back to you and says, oh no, I don't want to go with this product, and you say, okay, it is Codemarked, oh, I'm still feeling uncomfortable about it because, you know, they might change the rules in 5 years' time, which is one response that we've had. You then say, okay, certifier, PCA, please tell me what standards are required as a minimum by this project in the National Construction Code that are not included in the Codemark certificate. And if they can't tell you what standards are not included, you then say you are legally obliged to approve the product. So that gives a bit of power back to all of us, specifiers and manufacturers, because with this whole combustible cladding thing that's been going on, there have been no low-rise issues around non-combustibility with cladding in buildings, but Weathertech has been receiving quite a bit of pushback. We've never been able to be used above 3 stories anyway. You know, that rule has changed. We can now only go to 2 stories because of changes to the rules, but we're working on that at the moment. But we still sometimes get pushback, even where we know we can be used because it's Type C construction across Class 2 to 9. And I mentioned before, one response was, oh, they might change the rules down the track. Well, you know, they might change the rules down the track about everything. So either it complies or it doesn't. Codemark now gives us the arsenal, if you like, to say, okay, well, you've got to approve us. Increase consumer confidence, because you go to that Codemark certificate and you've got a shorthand summary of the NCC requirements that a product meets, and thereby it infers the limitations. If it's not in the Codemark certificate, you can obviously, non-combustibility is not in the Weathertech's Codemark certificate because Weathertech is a natural timber-based product. So it's not non-combustible by its very nature. So we won't have any non-combustibility test reports in our Codemark certificate. But we will have the ones that we do comply with. This is important because it helps you guys to understand at a very early stage when you're specifying and nominating products how to minimise the risk of using or specifying non-compliant or non-conforming products. So who benefits from the use? Who benefits from using or specifying Codemark Australia products? So designers and specifiers, most of you guys are architects, building designers in the room here. Obviously it helps you to compare products. And if you've got 2 different types of cladding, for instance, and you think, hang on, well, I'm tossing between the 2, I like them both, I like the environmental aspect of Weathertech, but I like something else about another product which isn't code marked. You might go, you know what, I'll go with Weathertech because it sort of ticks all the boxes and it's code marked. Hopefully that's how it influences some of your decisions. Approval authorities, building certifiers, PCAs, it obviously helps them to reach decisions quicker. Builders and building owners, when builders are happy to use Codemark certified products, I don't think it's as big a deal for them as it is for some of the other stakeholders. But interestingly, trade suppliers, the guys on the counters at Bunnings, we were really surprised when we told them, hey, look, we've got Codemark certification. They're like, oh, fantastic, because they can then quickly go to their Codemark certificate online and see what standards are referenced, where we comply within the code. And when a builder rings up and says, oh, I need some cladding to do this, this and this, he'll be able to just go to that Codemark certificate and go, yep, you can use Weathertech or whatever the product may be. So we were very surprised that trade suppliers know more about Codemark in general than most of the market. So what does Codemark mean for cladding systems? So companies like Weathertech, we manufacture our products to a product specification standard, and those standards are sometimes referenced in the construction code. We propose a system of installation which is linked to warranty and purpose of use limitations. So that kind of speaks for itself. You need to install it in a certain way to get a warranty from Weathertech. And the purpose of use limitation, one example would be, don't use it on a class 2 to 9 commercial project of type A or type B construction because it won't comply. The other thing about installation is it may be structured or layered in order to maintain compliance. And by that we mean, not only do you need to follow the installation instructions, and whether it's Weathertech or James Hardie fibre cement or CSR, bare stone, they're all going to have installation instructions. You must follow all manufacturers' instructions as outlined. But when we say those instructions will be structured or layered, in the case of cladding, it may well be that you need to source a vapour permeable membrane in addition to the cladding. There might be flashings required around the tops of windows and doors and the tops of parapets that aren't supplied by the cladding manufacturer and are made up by the builder. The fixings may not be supplied by the cladding manufacturer. So these other components are important to the installation of the product in order for you to follow the installation instructions. And so that's what we talk about layered and structured installation systems. So Weathertech, when we did our Codemark certification, we looked at weatherproofing, structural reliability, lifetime expectancy, and Weathertech has an extremely long lifetime expectancy. We're not quite sure how long it lasts for, but it'll certainly outlast me. Bushfire attack level or BAL ratings, and FRLs as well. So there's 5 key areas. We're looking at adding acoustics and thermal performance because these are other areas that we get asked about quite a bit. There's quite a push at the moment for passive design, and Weathertech has been used on a number of passive projects, even here in Sydney. So our Codemark certification is a dynamic document. We can add to it as the rules change and as we introduce more tests. Some other cladding companies out there may only have 1 or 2 of these things Codemarked. So just because you see that Codemark logo doesn't mean, yes, I can use it. It means check and see what's included in that certificate, make sure it correlates with what your requirements are. And if it doesn't, check with the manufacturer because chances are they may have the tests that you require, but it just may not have been put into their Codemark. So who accesses product installation, product systems and their performances in cladding? Okay, so if we look at timber, hardboard, weatherboards, fibre cement, brick cladding systems, all of these cladding solutions do have deemed to satisfy pathways in the construction code. But there's certain cladding systems on the market that we see quite a bit that do not have deemed to satisfy pathways. So things like aluminium composite panels, they're the ones that have been quite controversial of late. They don't have a deemed to satisfy pathway. Polystyrene cladding is another one. We don't see polystyrene used a great deal in commercial projects in Australia. You do overseas, but we do see polystyrene used in Class 110 housing residential projects. So manufacturers of ACPs and polystyrene cladding, they may use Codemark Australia as a way of showing where they comply with the code. So even though they're not going to have a deemed to satisfy pathway for the use of their product, having Codemark will simplify performance solutions for the use of their products. So the reason why companies like Weathertech and James Hardie and Boral and CSR have Codemark, even though we have deemed to satisfy provisions around the use of our products in the NCC, it helps to give our customers confidence in what we're doing, and it's an additional tool that helps us to reinforce marketplace confidence in our products. And you know, it's, to be honest with you, Victoria now, and our company is national, international, when you consider we export to like 17 countries. But we find that Victoria is a little bit ahead of New South Wales, and New South Wales a little bit ahead of Queensland in terms of market trends around compliance. And Codemark is pretty well required down there for anything, informally, but people are generally only specifying Codemark products down there. So it helps us to provide credibility to our products, and in turn, the Codemark brand gets reinforced by big brands like James Hardie, CSR, and smaller brands that are also well known, like Weathertech. So it's kind of a two-way street. So that's Codemark. I did say we're going to go into quite a bit of detail about that, but hopefully you have a better understanding of what Codemark is. Does anyone have any questions on Codemark before we move on? No? Okay, you're all still awake, so that's a good thing. Let's now have a look at Certificate of Accreditation. And as I said, I'm only going to touch on these other 5 evidences of suitability. So Certificate of Accreditation is like Codemark, but it's state-based. It's not national. So it's pretty much the same thing. You've got standards within that state BCA that the products or the designs, but generally we're talking about products, comply with. And it may well be something like, well, we give the example here of Geelong Polystyrene Cladding, which is generally only sold in Victoria and Tasmania, and so they may use a certificate of accreditation that is suitable for those states because that's all they need to do, and it is easier and quicker and cheaper to achieve than Codemark. The other example I think of is when you land in Hobart and you land in Melbourne and you see those evaporative coolers on people's roofs. We don't see them very much in our part of the state. I was just in the Central West last week and I noticed that there are evaporative coolers out there too, but they're very much a climate sort of focused thing, and they might use certificates of accreditation as opposed to Codemark because their products are probably only suitable to the drier regions in Australia rather than, say, far north Queensland or the tropics or even Sydney where it does get a bit humid. So a certificate of accreditation can also be referenced if you were wanting to use those products in another state. You might borrow some of the information out of the Certificate of Accreditation in order to provide evidence of suitability to your PCA, even if that certificate is not valid for your state. Probably all I need to say about that. Do you guys ever come across certificates of accreditation in your... I don't see them very much. This is something that you may see a little bit more, and it's certificate issued by a certification body. This can make up part of your Certificate of Accreditation and part of your Codemark certificate as well. But it's basically, again, a document that says, you know, this building product, for example, complies with these NCC reference standards, and the certificate has been issued by a CAB, a Conformity Assessment Body, and a CAB, again, is accredited by JASANS, the Joint Australia Standard, New Zealand, whatever it is, JASANS. So, and it's going to include obvious key details, such as, you know, what are the details of the testing, how long it'll be valid, and so on. So to give an example of what this may be, we have the Engineered Wood Products Association of Australasia, and they have a standard, if you like, for stress grading of sawn and engineered wood products. So if I was out there and I'm bringing in you know, logs into my sawmill, and then I'm processing those logs according to this stress grading of sawn and engineered wood products standard, and I'm following those rules, I can get a certificate from the EWPAA to say that, okay, this species of timber at this size is providing certain structural performance, if you like. I don't know a great deal about this, but you get the idea. And the EWPAA would do regular independent audits that have public available rules to outline the framework and how it works. And they would also go and do spot checks on the mills, make sure they're doing the right thing. So as you can see, this is sort of drilling down into some of the detail that might make up part of your Codemark certificate or your Certificate of Accreditation. Report issued by an accredited testing laboratory. Again, this is something where these reports are making up parts of your Certificate of Accreditation and parts of your Codemark. So we have standards referenced in the NCC. A lot of those standards will refer to testing, and the testing will be outlined in the standard, and you basically go to a NATA accredited testing laboratory, and then they'll do the testing on your product and make sure that it complies with the requirements of the standard. So NATA, as an organisation, they go into these NATA accredited labs and they make sure that everything's calibrated correctly, that they're working to the right standards, the place is clean and tidy, that basically that all the NATA rules are being followed in the lab. And NATA is an Australian not-for-profit. It's recognised by the Commonwealth Government. And the other important thing that NATA does is if you're, say, an importer who's bringing products in from America, for instance, those products have been tested in America to American standards. NATA labs can look at those American standards and then sort of reinterpret them to Australian standards and let you know whether you need to do more testing or whether the American testing is enough, that type of thing. There's also this International Laboratory Accreditation Cooperation Mutual Recognition Arrangement, the ILAC-MRA. You can tell this has been written by an engineer, can't you? But that's basically an agreement that these labs have all around the world so that they can share information, share testing, and make sure that the standards around the world are uniform, pretty much. Here's an example of a test report done on our Weathergroove architectural panels, and this was a test on weatherproofing, and it was done by Ian Benny and Associates in Melbourne. Must be a well-known NATA accredited lab because the company I used to work for had some of their glass operable walls tested for weatherproofing as well by Ian Benny, so he's obviously reputable and well-known laboratory. These reports are about 30-40 pages long. They have a lot of information in them, lots of photographs showing how the tests were conducted and so on. Here's another test report which looks at AS 1530.4, which is all about FRL testing of Weathertechs. And again, 30 or 40 pages, and I always just go to the conclusions and make sure that everything complies. Number 5 in our level of rigour is a certificate or report from a professional engineer, recognised expert or other appropriately qualified person. So these often are part of a performance solution in terms of compliance, and you need to use, obviously, a structural engineer for structural issues. You're not going to go to a mechanical engineer if you're trying to do a structural performance solution and vice versa. And basically, they will look at the material, the product, the form of construction or design, and prove in their report that it's going to fulfil specific requirements within the code. And as I said earlier, opinions are no longer relevant. They need to follow a rigorous method of analysis to show that the standards have been met. And you have to include the standards, specifications, rules, codes of practice, and any other publications that have been relied upon. So it could be a professional engineer. Sometimes it may not even be a professional engineer. It might be, and this would only be part of your evidence. It couldn't be the be-all and end-all, but it might be contributing towards your evidence that you get a report from a builder who's done this with LVLs for 30 years, and in his experience, he's had this type of, I'm giving you examples here. You guys are going to know better than me, but they don't necessarily need to be in New South Wales qualified with a degree. It just depends on the evidence that they're providing. Something that's important and is part of this process is what we talk about here with finite element analysis. So when we were doing, for example, the Weathertech's Codemark testing, there's about 50-odd product lines across all Weathertech's weatherboard and architectural panel ranges. And we're not going to test every single product line, because within those 50 product lines, we've got 5 ranges. And so roughly each range has about 10 products. And the variation within those products within each range might just be how the surface is machined. One might be smooth, one might have a coarse grain texture, but the performance, say, with weatherproofing will be exactly the same. So they use finite element analysis to take the raw test data from the testing that has actually physically taken place, and then they'll do things like look at, instead of a 450 stud centre, what happens if we move the studs to 600 centres? How does that affect the structural integrity of the installation? What if we use screws instead of nails? If we use different centre fixings, instead of 200, maybe we go to 300 centres. We use different plank widths. A lot of this information can be extrapolated, if you like, from the raw data that has been derived from the actual testing, and they call that finite element analysis, and it's part of this certification or report from a professionally qualified person. And you'll be pleased to know that we're on our last form of documentary evidence, which can be, but is not limited to, a product technical statement. So without going into too much detail, and they've gone into a lot of detail about this, we're talking here about low-risk applications. So if the product's probably never going to fail, and if it does, it's not a big deal. You know, we're not having to spend $2 million, you know, to replace a membrane. We're talking about maybe a few $100s for day labour to get somebody in to replace, you know, a failed underlay, for instance. It's not a big risk. So here's an example of a product technical statement on one of Weathertech's lines, and it'll have a description of the product, the application and intended use of the product, and it'll also include here the compliance with the code in Volume 1 and Volume 2. So you can go to those sections of the code and see where it complies. So again, it's the hardboard underlay. That's probably all we'd need to say about this. We don't really need to go into this level of detail, I don't believe, but product technical statements, again, may be combined with other forms of documentary evidence in order to provide all the information that your PCA or certifier might need. So, in conclusion, Part A5 of each volume of the Construction Code contains the 6 methods of providing evidence of compliance. Each method requires demonstration that the product meets the relevant part of the code for its intended use. Products that are new or the consequence of failure is high require more rigour than a product that has a strong history of successful performance. So, for example, Codemark is the highest level of rigour, and Codemark Australia is the only method that has automatic acceptance by the approving authority. So, have you all learnt a little bit about compliance and Codemark today? Yes? Does anyone have any questions? Has anyone had any situations recently where they've been dealing with a certifier or a PCA and they've been asking for this sort of evidence? I mean, it probably happens all the time, but maybe not to you guys individually. Okay. Yes?
It's not really such a problem now because of improved products. That is, ages ago there was a great problem created by the movement of Weathertech within
A stud wall, yeah. So.
with your products, is there variation in the nature of your VPMs for the specific product? And if an incorrect one is used, could it avoid any warranties?
Well, yes, and our next presentation is going to be all about this. When you say VPM, you're talking about vapor permeable membranes and condensation getting trapped inside lightweight stud wall construction, creating mould and that sort of thing. Yeah, so look, that's part of the method of installation. So if we're talking about this in the context of compliance, if you don't use the right sort of vapor permeable membrane, and in some cases you don't also include a cavity batten in your lightweight wall construction, you may void the warranty from the manufacturer. And I know in the case of lightweight foam systems like XPS and EPS foam, it's critical that you use a vapor permeable membrane and you use a batten regardless of the climate zone or where you are, because those foams do not breathe at all. So in that case, you wouldn't be compliant if you didn't follow the installation instructions to the T. So in our next presentation, we're actually going to address this particular point in some detail.
It can be an issue where somebody strips all the fibro off an old fibro house.
Yep.
Oh, put your Weathertech on it. Hello.
Yeah, look at all this mould.
You didn't do all the rest with it.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. I mean, there are a lot of factors that need to be taken into account, and not least of which is the climate of the area we're talking about, because in the cooler climates is where we have a bigger risk associated with condensation getting trapped inside walls. But exactly as you say, if you use the two design solutions that I mentioned earlier, you will mitigate the risk associated with condensation being trapped in walls. So if you hang around for the next one, you'll learn about that in detail. And it's a bit more interesting than this one, I think. Any other questions, comments? So thank you very much, everybody, for your attention. I really appreciate it. I think we're having a break now, and then I'll come back.
We will do, actually. Was there any question and answers that they needed to do now?
Oh, yes, of course. God, I'm glad you're here. I would have completely
forgotten. With some of the answers, everybody?
Thank Christ. I would have completely forgotten about that. I blame stage fright. All right. If you've got your little quizzes there, we'll go through this as a team. And look, if people want to yell out the answers, that would be great, so don't be shy. Which piece of documentary evidence has automatic acceptance by approving authorities? A, yes, Codemark Australia Certificate of Conformity. And the performance requirements are satisfied by which of the following? D, all of the above, so it can be a combination of performance and deemed to satisfy solutions, or one or the other. Which part of each volume of the NCC contains information about what we've just been talking about? C, A5, correct. Is Codemark Australia compulsory? No, it's not. An accredited testing lab is a testing lab accredited by NATA. That's right, not nacho or naan. They're their favourite foods, but they've got nothing to do with what we're talking about. How many methods of documentary evidence are accepted by the BCA NCC? 6. Compliance with the NCC is achieved by complying with... Can you see the answer there? The governing requirements are the rules, and the performance requirements are how you meet those rules. New or innovative product components where the consequences of failure have been assessed as high typically require an assessment using B, more rigorous options to prove compliance. Which of the following forms of evidence is the most rigorous? A, Codemark. And who administers Codemark? B, Jazans. So there's your answers. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrew. Round of applause for Andrew, please.